Thor, son of Odin and god of thunder, lay hidden in a large kettle together with Tyr the brave. They were in the dwelling place of Hymir the giant, who was Tyr's estranged father. Hymir was close to turning the house upside down, as he demanded to know where the visitors, whose footsteps he'd seen in the snow, were hiding. Tyr's mother could only tremble and scream in terror as Hymir raged on. But how did the mighty god of thunder and protector of mankind find himself in such a precarious situation? It all began when the Aesir, the gods, paid a dinner visit to the old Aegir, the king of the ocean. Ogur lived under the sea in a magnificent coral palace together with his wife, Queen Ran, and his daughters, the Waves. While delighted at the company, Ogier was unprepared for such a large party, and hence did not have enough mead for all his guests. To make matters worse, he didn't even have a kettle large enough to brew enough mead for his guests. After much pondering and head-scratching, Ogier approached the gods with his dilemma. Then Tyr had a brilliant idea. His father, the giant Hymir, possessed a large kettle a mile deep, just what the occasion called for. The only hiccup remaining now was how to retrieve the kettle. Never one to back from a challenge, Thor volunteered to go fetch the kettle as long as Tyr accompanied him to show him the way. Well, they didn't call him the Brave for nothing, so Tyr agreed. And so they journeyed long and fast to Giant Land, until they arrived at Hymir's palace near Elivagar, the River of Ice. It was here that Tyr was born, and had lived before he ran away to live in Asgard. Guided by Tyr, the pair quickly found Hymir's giant kettles 8 in number. While still contemplating which one to take with them in, came Tyr's grandmother, a giantess with 900 heads, each more dreadful than the other. A bad-tempered creature, she began to roar and bellow at the sight of Tyr, whom she was not very fond of. But as luck would have it, Tyr's mother came in at that very moment and sent way the wicked grandmother. A fair and sweet woman, Tyr's mother fell upon his neck with kisses and tears of joy. After all, she had finally laid eyes on her beloved son, whom she'd missed dearly for years. Tyr confided in his mother the important mission that had brought him back to the home he'd escaped as a child. Of course, she was ready to help, although she warned them that Hymir had been in a terrible mood for days, and that the mere sight of a stranger would send him into rage. She conspired to hide the pair in the largest and strongest of the kettles, lest they be discovered by Hymir, who was at that very moment on his way home from a hunt. No sooner had they concealed themselves than Hymir's thunderous footsteps came echoing and shaking the palace walls themselves. All Tyr and Thor could do was stay still and hope for the best. But alas, their footsteps, etched in snow, had already told the giant all he needed to know. He entered the palace with furious anger, demanding his wife produce the visitors. At first, Tyr's mother tried to placate him that his dear son had returned, but in his eyes, Tyr was nothing but a rascal. His loathing was made even worse when he rightfully suspected Tyr had brought with him an Asgardian, the very people he'd been taught to hate for slaughtering the giants. In her desperate attempt to help, Tyr's mother lied that they were standing behind one of the palace pillars. With a glare from his frosty eyes, Hymir cracked the marble pillar in two. There was no one there, but together with it, the great roof beam that held the 8 kettles came tumbling down. The kettles all shattered into pieces, except one, the largest. Then out stepped Thor and Tyr. Side by side, they bowed to Hymir and stood looking amused by the ruckus. Chances are they actually were, for it was not Thor's first stint in Giant Land. Surprisingly, Hymir invited them to a supper where he mostly ignored his son, but eyed Thor with a frown. He couldn't help but wonder which of Odin's sons this was. Now, for all of Thor's accomplishments in battle, he was equally as valiant in his appetite. Of the 3 roast oxen Hymir had on the table, the thunder god devoured 2 of them himself. Ever the gruff, Hymir was quick to start lamenting and concluded that if Thor was to dine with him the next day, he'd have to catch his own food. Not one to take petty disrespect to heart, Thor agreed. And so a fishing date was set for the next day. In the morning, Hymir and Thor both rose early for their expedition. To no one's surprise, Hymir wouldn't provide his guest with bait. Undeterred, Thor looked around and sighted a herd of Hymir's oxen feeding in the meadow. Aha, just what he needed. He seized the hugest of them all and trotted with it to shore under his arm, all with as much ease as if he were carrying a handful of clam. Enraged, Hymir tried to leave Thor behind by rowing away from shore as fast as he could. But with one long step, Thor firmly planted himself at the center of Hymir's boat. He'd been invited for fishing, and fishing he had to go. After all, the bait was already in his arms. With Thor at the stern and Hymir at the prow, the two rowed with fervor like never before. Indeed, no one had ever seen a boat skip as fast as Hymir's did on that day. Far and fast they rowed, until they came to a spot where Hymir claimed held the best fortune. Thor inquired what kind of fish could be caught there, and Hymir proudly exclaimed, "Whales! He caught nothing smaller than whales." The mighty thunder god was again deeply amused, referring to whales as small fry. He declared they should row out even further to find something worth his time. With that, he began to row faster than before. Mortified, the giant repeatedly asked the god of thunder to stop. For they were now in the waters of the dreadful Midgard serpent. To Hymir's surprise, Thor exclaimed that that was the exact fish he was after. With that, the god dropped his line, baited with the entire head of the ox he'd brought along. Nevertheless, Hymir was determined to put up a brave face. He too cast his line, and as luck would have it, he was the first one to make a catch. Two massive whales on one hook. Forgetting his fear for a moment, the giant couldn't help but gloat. Suddenly, Thor's line too got a bite so strong it rocked the entire boat and threatened to capsize it. It was the Midgard serpent, the brother of the Fenris wolf. The serpent struggled so furiously that it pulled Thor's feet straight through the bottom of the boat to the sea floor. But it was no match for an Aesir. At last, Thor reeled its head out of the water, and dreadful was its sight. With monstrous red eyes, fire-breathing nostrils, and poison-dripping fangs, the monster came up with a wave, a mountain high. Terror struck the giant. Just as Thor released his hammer to strike the serpent dead, Hymir cut the god's fishing line. As such, instead of killing it, the blow only crashed to the creature's head and it sank to the bottom with a great tumult that shook the very foundations of the sea. Well, Hymir had seen enough. He swam back to land, leaving Thor to wade ashore, boat on his shoulders, filled with both water and Hymir's whale catch. Deeply embarrassed, the giant couldn't wait to rid himself of the unwanted guest. But first, he had to pay back the embarrassment. For this task, he took a small cup of his and dared Thor to break it to prove his strength. The task seemed simple enough, so Thor threw it with all his might against the stone flooring. Only the stone shattered. With this, the giant and all his servants burst into laughter and delight. At last, there was something Thor couldn't do. Slowly but surely, Thor began to get worked up. He hurled the cup again, this time against the iron pillars of the palace. But like a rubber ball, it simply bounced back into Hymir's hands. The company of giants now added dance and mockery to their celebrations, which only served to infuriate the god more. In this frenzied merriment, they failed to notice Tyr's mother draw close to Thor and whisper something in his ear. All of a sudden, Thor picked up the cup and hurled it with even more might straight at Hymir's forehead, for it was the hardest substance in the world. The giant stood surprised, but without a scratch on him. The cup, however, had shattered into a million pieces. To the giant's credit, he regained his composure pretty fast and congratulated Thor, albeit patronizingly. He quickly began thinking of a new challenge when his eyes came upon his large mead kettle, the very thing that Tyr and Thor had journeyed for. To prove his strength, Thor had to lift it. Tyr went up first, tried, and failed. Stepping on the floor, Thor braced himself and in 3, 2, 1, swung the giant kettle to his head. He staggered for the door, with Tyr following close behind him. By the time the astonished giants could recover their composure, Thor and Tyr had already covered considerable ground. But when they glanced backward, a vast crowd of horrible and furious giants was advancing, baying for their lives. Terrified, Tyr begged Thor to do something to stop their advance. And so Thor set the kettle down and drew out the Mjolnir, his might hammer. With a dreadful flash, it flew from his hand, taking out all the pursuing giants, including Hymir himself. Only Tyr's mother was spared. With that, Tyr and Thor safely returned to Oegir's sea palace, where the banquet was still going on, and where the Aesir were still waiting patiently for their mead, for time does not go so fast below the quiet waves as on shore. After many praises and congratulations from the rest of the party, all Odin, Thor's father, found to say was that whatever Thor sets out to do, that he always accomplishes, and that was praise enough for anyone. If you have enjoyed this video, make sure to smash the like button and subscribe for more content. It helps this channel reach more audience, which in return helps us create more videos for you guys. Don't forget to share and leave a comment too. Until next time, take care.